There is just so much waste. They were spending so much money so quickly.
Quite what they're doing, talking about public health matters and asking for posts to be pulled down is another question entirely.
And I record it. And what I don't do is I don't edit it, because these people have a history that has been erased as we speak.
It seems that the Victoria Police tactic of arresting people unjustly for the exclusive purpose of imposing ridiculous bail conditions may have spread to Queensland. Just 2 days ago, Dr. William Bayer, suspended medical doctor, suspended by AHPRA for medical thought crimes, was arrested by police whilst protesting outside the AHPRA offices. He was held overnight as the police tried time and again to bully him into signing a gag order, stopping him from continuing his public awareness campaign against AHPRA. William refused, and yesterday he was released without those bail conditions and went right back to protesting. There's a few things we can learn from this. Firstly, even the police knew the bail conditions they were trying to bully him into signing weren't necessary. If they were necessary for public safety or anything like that, then they would have continued to hold William until he signed. The fact that they gave up clearly shows it was a scare tactic and not a necessity from a law enforcement or a public safety perspective. Secondly, if he hadn't had the guts to stand his ground under that kind of pressure, then their scare tactics would have worked and he would be gagged unjustly and unable to continue his efforts to hold AHPRA accountable. As a former Victorian, these tactics are all too familiar. We saw bail conditions being used strategically by Victoria Police with the same unjust arrest and bullying tactics purely for the purpose of taking people out of the fight, using bail conditions to force them to shut up and stop standing up for their rights. If you've seen my documentary Battleground Melbourne, then you're already familiar with this footage I'll show you in a second, captured by Marty Fokker, one of the many courageous Victorians who kept standing up despite Victoria Police being willing to, well, listen for yourself.
You want to turn that off?
I'll turn it off, hang on. Let me turn it off.
It's got a cover on anyway.
112 probably.
There's all sorts of things wrong with this malicious abuse of the legal system to achieve political outcomes. If we take off the rose-coloured glasses that we tend to look at Australia with and just look at it for what it is, what we're seeing here is exactly the sort of thing that we would decry if it happened overseas. And when considered in concert with the state and federal government's censorship of Australians online, it starts to sound like something straight out of the Soviet Union. If you speak up online, you are suppressed, and if you speak out in person, you are arrested, and they use bail conditions to suppress you. And once they trump up some charges, as the Victoria Police were very fond of doing, as we heard in Marty's video and as I know from personal experience, they have you trapped in the legal system for years if they so desire. Have you heard the phrase, the process is the punishment? Well, it applies here. Yes, the legal system follows a process, and in most cases, people who have been maliciously accused by Victoria Police are getting off without punishment or even having the charges dropped before trial. So some people like to say, hey, all's well that ends well. What are you whinging about? It doesn't change the fact that the process itself is the punishment, and the police know that. The years of waiting, the legal costs, the psychological pressure. The police know very well that many, if not most of the people they're laying charges against don't deserve those charges. And they know very well the cost to those people, even if they're found innocent or even if the charges get dropped just before the trial. But they do it anyway. They routinely make mischievous arrests and lay malicious charges because then you become just another sausage in the so-called justice system to be chewed up and spat out years later with massive legal bills, even if you're innocent. The purpose is not justice, it's to deny people's political freedoms through bail conditions. And it's wrong at every level. It's wrong that officers participate in politicised policing like what we saw in Victoria, like what we're witnessing with William Bay. It's wrong that police command appear to be sanctioning such actions. And it's wrong that the court system is so easily exploited by bad actors determined to use the system itself as a punishment. And finally, it's wrong that there's no punishment for the officers involved and engaged in such blatant human rights abuse. No accountability at all. I'm not sure how we're going to fix this. But I do know that the more people that know about it and are wise to the tactic, the more people will have the courage to not give in to the scare tactics. The more people will take a leaf from Dr. William Bay's playbook and simply refuse to sign. If you sign, you have a problem because you're bound by those bail conditions or else. But if you don't sign, then the longer they hold you, the more of a problem they have. And if the alternative media get a hold of the story, as Michael Gray Griffith got a hold of Dr. William Bay's story when he was arrested, and immediately began to get the word out, the more time passes, the bigger that problem becomes for them. Dr. Bay called their bluff, refused to sign, and the police ran out of time. But they only ran out of time because people were calling the police station, doing welfare checks on Dr. Bay, and because there were people outside the station waiting for his release, and because the story was circulating on social media thanks to Michael Gray Griffith. That is why the police ran out of time. So it's a combined effort. Those put under that pressure need to stand up to it, and the rest of us need to put the pressure back on the police so that they run out of time before their victim is forced to sign something that they otherwise wouldn't. Our so-called justice system is very broken and being misused, and police forces around Australia are disturbingly casual about abusing the system for political purposes. We can't fix it overnight, but we can be part of the pushback. Right now, Victoria Police are continuing their prosecution of Nick Patterson. You may remember him from earlier episodes of the Aussie Wire. Nick has been organising for people to peacefully attend the court during his trial to stand in quiet but resolute support of justice for Nick. In response, the police have changed the starting date of his trial and changed prosecutor. Nick, like William Bay, is standing his ground. And like William, he needs us to be there for him, keeping the prosecutors accountable and ensuring that they can't get away with playing games. For more information on how you can be there for Nick as he works to keep police accountable, go to t.me/FightCorruptPolice and join that channel. The link is in the description, of course. Thank you to Nick Patterson for fighting on. Thank you to William Bay for standing your ground. And thank you to Michael from Cafe Locked Out and to everyone else that supported William and helped to spread his story. Together we made a difference yesterday, and together we'll do it again for Nick and other people beyond. I hope to interview William in a future episode of the Aussie Wire News, but for now, here is today's news. Well, here on the Aussie Wire, we reported last episode about the 4,000 plus social media posts that were suppressed during COVID at the request of the Australian federal government. The only reason we know about that is thanks to my next guest, Senator Alex Antic. Senator Antic, thank you so much for joining us on the Aussie Wire today.
Thanks, Topher. Thanks for having me.
Now, what you've done is successfully confirm something that a lot of us suspected for a very long time, but you were able to actually get hard documentation confirming this. For those that don't understand the process, what is a Freedom of Information request and what made you pursue this particular information?
Yeah, well, a Freedom of Information request is effectively a statutory request of a government department under the Freedom of Information Act. There are state versions, but this was the Commonwealth version of that legislation, and it, in many cases, compels the federal government department to release documents that are relevant to the public interest. And there's a whole lot of carve-outs to that, things that might have national security implications or business dealings or have personal information. But it's a pretty powerful tool, even though the manner in which it's used sometimes is a little bit laborious. And it took 6 months to get this information, with a whole lot of back and forth between the Department of Home Affairs. But it all started in the late last year after the so-called Twitter files scandal arose in the United States. And it got me thinking whether or not, as you said, my suspicions that there was more going on here during the COVID period in censorship terms than we thought was happening here in Australia as well. And lo and behold, we were provided with a document which was basically a procedural guide for Home Affairs staff. Now, I would love to be able to tell you more about that, but I can't because 28 pages were given and 28 pages were redacted. So it is basically a 28-page document with black on it. And so I can't tell you any more about that. What I can tell you, though, is that they also released information which suggested that over a 5-year period, and we sort of used that because you want to know a little bit before the pandemic and hopefully a little bit after if possible. But this was a period between January 17 and December 2022, which is when we made the request. And it showed that the Department of Home Affairs had on 13,000 odd occasions requested various social media companies, so that could be a combination of all of the above, Facebook, Twitter, whoever, Instagram. On 13,000 occasions, they'd asked for posts to be pulled down. 9,000 of those were, understandably and quite rightly, relating to terrorism-related material, which was the intent of this Operation First Up. I mean, this was what it was designed to do. But 4,213 then drifted into what they're calling COVID-related posts. Now, the Home Affairs Department of Home Affairs, is a department that's designed to deal with terrorism, border control, those sorts of issues. Quite what they're doing, talking about public health matters and asking for posts to be pulled down is another question entirely. And we did put those to the department during Senate estimates on Monday, and we were basically told in no uncertain terms that we were just doing what the Department of Health told us because we had this system set up. So it got appropriated. I'm probably using language they wouldn't like, but that's basically what happened. To drift into pulling down COVID posts that we didn't like.
Well, this is.
So what does that mean? Who's the arbiter of truth there?
This is mission creep at its most insidious, because these people are sitting there feeling very virtuous about what they're doing and not really thinking about the separation of powers, the principles of limited government, and using what was designed, as you say, for terrorist and violence type of content, and using that now for what should have been a healthy and robust debate about the COVID situation. Now, I had numerous of my own posts censored. Whether any of those were by the federal government or not remains to be seen. We'll talk in a moment about how we're going to try and actually find out more detail about what was censored. But my first question for you is, what are the implications for the federal government if it proves to be the case, as I am of the opinion it will very likely be the case, that some of the information they actively suppressed was actually correct, whilst at the same time the information being pushed by the federal government has proven to not be entirely correct, and I'm being quite generous. What are the implications there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, that we would almost certainly assume is the case now as well, because we know a lot of the stuff that was off limits, such as these vaccines aren't going to stop transmission. Now we know, we actually knew at the time, but the regime didn't know, are correct. That's right. So what are the ramifications? Look, that's a very good question. It's probably one I can't answer. To suffice to say that I still think we need a proper Royal Commission into the whole range of activities across all states, by the way, across the whole country, as to what happened. I mean, you documented really well what happened in Melbourne, in Victoria, on your documentary, and that's just a piece of the puzzle. I mean, there's so many angles to this that it would require an enormous investigation. We have asked during the hearings, but we're going to go back in writing and ask now for the entire document to be provided. That is the unredacted document, so we know what sort of instructions the staff were getting. But also we want to know what the posts actually said. So what does misinformation or disinformation look like to the department? One thing we were told during the hearing was that the department was also relying on the social media companies' procedural guidelines. So what you seem to have here is this giant censorship industrial complex involving potentially the World Health Organization, the CDC, various Australian government departments, including the Department of Health, all working in tandem with big tech companies to curate what the Australian people see in relation to a public health matter. I don't like this at all, Topher. I don't like this at all, and I don't think Aussies should like this at all either.
Benito Mussolini, considered the father of fascism, described fascism as the merger between the state and corporations. And this is what, to my eye, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to my eye, this is what I feel like I'm seeing. There is a merging where governments are now treating private companies almost as extensions of themselves for the purposes of, in this case, limiting information for the public. How can people support someone like yourself? I've been making this point repeatedly. There are so many people that throw their hands up in the air and say, all politicians are the same. There's no point. Don't get involved in elections. Don't get involved in politics. And I can understand where they're coming from. We've been disappointed and let down so many times. But the fact remains that yourself, amongst a handful of others, are genuinely working to try and bring light and truth into politics, which is a pretty thankless task at the best of times. How do people support people like yourself and others? There is a small list of really great people. How do we strengthen your position so that you can do what you do?
Well, there's a couple of things, Topher. The first thing I'd suggest is if people want to sign up to my bi-monthly newsletter where I put some of these things out, www.alexantic.com.au. There's a join section there and you can stay in touch. That way we can't be censored. So having emails and being able to contact people like that is so important. But the other thing I'd say to people is I know they're cynical about politics. So I understand that. I hear it all the time. But what's critical is that we make sure that we give people who are going to stand for our values the best opportunity to get there in the first place. And that means joining political parties. And I've been saying to people for the longest time, if you go and have a look at the actual values of a party like the Liberal Party, read those and join others that are sort of fighting for these freedoms. What we need is people involved in those institutions, like a party of government that can actually get elected and go to Parliament and stand firm on these issues, because it's very, very difficult for outsiders, independents, minor parties to make a splash. I just think we need to make sure that we're getting the right people into the seats, giving them the best opportunity to get pre-selected. And that involves people not just sitting around whinging, not posting on Telegram, not posting on Instagram, not doing this, that, and the other. It means rolling up your sleeves and getting involved in the machinery of politics and finding like-minded people to support or to be the ones that they support. That's the only way this gets fixed.
Yeah, it's, as I like to say, do the boring. The support the major party versus support the minor party debate is one that I was asked about at the Church and State Conference, and my answer was, if you're questioning whether you should be involved with a major party or a minor party, the answer is yes. Because if you're asking yourself that question, it means you're not involved yet. So just get off your backside and get involved. Just pick one and get out there and get involved. Senator Alex Antic, thank you so much. More strength to your arm. I look forward to seeing more details about these 4,000 plus posts. I'll be very curious to see if any of my own are in that list. But certainly we need to make sure that accountability happens. And I thank you for being one of the few that is working towards that.
Thanks, Topher. Good on you. Thanks again.
Cheers. I drink a brew coffee every morning because it's great coffee made easy. Brew is organic, specialty grade coffee that is roasted, ground and sealed in individual servings right here in Australia. Perfect for the work site, for the campsite, for travellers on the flight deck or at home on the back deck. Brew, it's great coffee made easy. BrewAustralia.com. Use the code TAW10 for a 10% discount every time you buy. Here on the Aussie Wire, we have talked about the fact that Victoria is, in my opinion, the basket case state. That's what should probably be on their number plates. Why? Well, because they are both the most highly taxed and the deepest in debt of all of the states in Australia. Quite an achievement, if you ask me. But it gets even better, because a new Victorian budget has just been handed down and, well, there's more taxes. Here to talk about it with me is David Limbrick MP from Victoria. How are you, David?
Great, thanks. How are you, Topher?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for joining us. Look, I want to start by playing you a clip from Sky News, because my jaw hit the floor. Let's just start here, have a watch, and see if you can believe some of what you're hearing.
There's also concerns an increase in land tax could be passed on to renters in an already volatile market. The Premier said it's not land tax driving up rent, but a lack of supply. He's also pointed out any land tax is fully tax deductible.
Well, landlords, any land tax is fully tax deductible.
As for whether the Premier would have delivered this budget if an election was looming...
Well, I did lock people in their homes for a couple of years, mate, and I didn't do that for political benefit. I did it because it was the right thing to do. As I said to you, with the greatest of respect, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think I've demonstrated to the Victorian community really clearly that I'm not just about doing the popular thing, I'm about doing what's right. And the right thing is to pay that credit card down.
Okay, he does say a few sensible things, and before I blow my stack
There's a lot to unpack there.
I'm going to hand over to you so I don't blow my stack, but let's start with, I think, two sensible things that he has said. One is that there needs to be an increase in supply of housing. This is something that you've spoken about before.
Yeah, we're in the middle of a stamp duty inquiry at the moment that I actually got up. And look, what the Premier said about land taxes not increasing rents directly, that's sort of true, but what they're doing here is disincentivizing people to become landlords, which is going to inhibit supply, which is exactly the problem that we've got. So yes, landlords can't easily just pass on costs, but it will restrict the supply of people or disincentivize people to become landlords, which will restrict supply, which will drive up costs. So I think it's a bit tricky, his wording there. He hasn't said anything that's technically wrong, but I think it's a bit misleading. Yeah.
I'll get to the other thing that I think it was correct that he said before we unpack the rest of what was in there, and that is that we need to be paying off this credit card, or Victoria needs to be paying off this credit card. This seems like an astonishing change of tune, though, from someone who doesn't seem to have been worried about the debt up until now.
he's absolutely right. We do need to pay off that debt. It's $31.5 billion. Now, there's a few reasons here that the government can't just keep borrowing forever. If they didn't make a commitment to do that, our credit rating would have been downgraded and Victoria would be in deep, deep trouble. We're paying millions and millions of dollars a day just in interest at the moment. If our credit rating got downgraded, bonds would be more expensive to sell for the government and we'd be in deep trouble. So they desperately needed to keep their credit rating. To their credit, pun intended, they actually got rated yesterday by S&P and they're going to maintain that. I think it's AA rating with S&P. So that's worked, but it's still a very dangerous tactic to increase taxes. They've done what they've always done. They've taken the soft targets in other budgets since I've been in Parliament. They've attacked gold miners, which, no one has any sympathy for, foreign investors, no one has any sympathy for. This time they're attacking large companies with large payrolls to increase payroll tax. I think that's very dangerous. And also property investors with multiple properties. Now, I think the payroll tax increase is very dangerous because it's attacking large companies, but those same large companies are often national and they can choose where they hire their staff. They don't have to hire them in Victoria. I'm very concerned that this will backfire. I don't think, increasing a tax for a company to employ people, I think that's a very bad idea.
All right, so let's talk though for a second about why there is this credit card to even pay off in the first place. Why is Victoria the most deeply in debt state?
Well, we had massive lockdowns and the government spent, at the time, they called it investments or packages or free stuff. But of course, it's not free. You have to pay it back. Look, now some of that expenditure was probably necessary, right? But a lot of it was just nonsense. Okay, there was I think yesterday we were looking at it. There was something like $170 million worth of PPE, protective gear for medical staff that was unusable. Didn't even meet our standards. They just it was useless. I think every parent who's got a child at school has a cupboard full of rat tests. They're probably about to expire, so that's a waste as well. I've heard of classrooms full of HEPA filters. They've got a storeroom full of HEPA filters. There is just so much waste. They were spending so much money so quickly that there is no way that they could have done it in a prudent way. And of course, now we've got to pay it back, and they're increasing taxes to do that.
Before we finish, I want to get to one last part of what he said that really sticks in my craw, and that is when he borderline boasted about the fact that he'd locked Victorians in their home for years and used that as evidence that he doesn't do what's popular, he does what's right. But we also know that he spent millions of dollars on focus groups and polling so that he could get the messaging right to make his lockdowns popular. I don't want to say what instinctively I want to say on air because it's going to get me into an awful lot of trouble. How does that strike you?
Well, I disagree. I think, my views are well known on this. I think lots of the measures that they took during COVID were extreme and unnecessary. The one that upsets me the most is closing our schools. Now, did that cost us a lot of money? Probably not, but I think it was absolutely unnecessary. Look, it's true. He has done some things that are very unpopular and he's tried very hard to sell them to the public. That's why he was doing the polling, so that he could figure out what's popular and what's not. I think everyone wants to put the pandemic behind us, but we've got this great big debt. We took actions that many of us, including you and I, thought were unnecessary, but now we've got to deal with the aftermath of all this. So,
after the party comes the hangover, and I don't know, look, I said before the last Victorian election that if Victorians re-elect Daniel Andrews, then I'm calling it Victoria is the California of Australia, and I'm not talking about the weather, I'm talking about the dysfunction of the taxation and the very, very hostile business environment, and unfortunately it looks like it's headed that way.
Look, I would say, though, there's a couple of things in the budget that I liked. Not many things, but there's a couple of things, and credit where it's due. I never just criticize the government just because they're the government.
Sure.
So they did two things. One of them, they scaled back the public service. This was actually Liberal Democrats' policy, can you believe? So they're scaling back the public service.
Valid point.
They even used the same wordings of us of cutting back the public service, excluding frontline workforce, which I was very impressed about. So I'll give them credit for that. Another thing that they've done, which is a really big thing, which I think will be good for Victoria, is they've agreed to abolish stamp duty for commercial and industrial property. I think that this is a good thing. This will hopefully result in Victoria being more attractive for investors who want to set up, factories or shops, lower that initial capital cost. So, credit where it's due. They've done these two things which are going to be very politically difficult for them. The unions are going to go crazy about especially the CPSU. They're going to go crazy about these job cuts. I think that the stamp duty change is not as far-reaching as what I would have liked, because they've excluded residential property, but still starting with industrial and commercial property is a good start. So it's not all bad, but it's not much good.
Well, look, thank you. I do appreciate the fact that you do try and be rational and balanced and fair, and also credit where it's due to you for getting the inquiry into stamp duty up. Now, it's not clear that this is a response to that inquiry, but the fact that you're putting it in the spotlight certainly won't have hurt in this particular case. That's all we have time for. David Limbrick, MP, thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire today.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Well, we opened the show today talking about these incredible revelations, courtesy of Senator Alex Antic, that our own federal government has participated in censoring Australian citizens when it came to information about COVID, over 4,000 times. But someone who's been very much affected, in fact, very recently affected by exactly these sorts of bans, is Michael Griffith from Cafe Lockdown. And I have particular concerns about what's happening in his case. Now, Michael joins me right now. Michael, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. And thank you for doing a story about this.
No, not at all. Now, you've been travelling all over Australia. For those that don't know, what do you do? What is Cafe Lockdown and what are you doing right now?
Well, we sort of, I guess we're independent journalists. This is what we've become. We're organically growing that way. And what I do is I interview people town to town. Usually I set up a thing called the Forest of the Fallen, and I either get invited to gatherings or people call me and say, I've got a story they want to tell, and I record it. And what I don't do is I don't edit it, because these people have a history that has been erased as we speak. And so I'm trying to capture history. So I try not to edit them. I just try, this is this person's story. And I just catalogue it and post it.
And I think it's an extraordinary service, because these are stories that the mainstream media will never pick up. The dinosaur media are not interested. And going and getting these stories is an incredible sacrifice on your part. It requires enormous amounts of travel, remoteness, a significant expense, and there is no revenue model in this. They're not paying you to get their stories out. They're not, you're not being syndicated or anything like that. How have you sustained yourself? Because you've been doing this now for many months, if not over a year. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's since just about a few months before the Shrine, where they shot us. So I've been doing Cafe Lockdown about a month before then. That's when it started. It's funded mainly by donations. We've got a few backers who keep us going. And I said to myself, as long as I have people donating and as long as I have people watching the interviews, I'll keep going. And we have had a few people come on and sponsor shows, but usually they get emailed by people saying, what are you supporting cop killers for? And their email gets filled up with people basically trying to shame them out of supporting us. So they can't continue to support us and be advertised on the show. There's an awful lot of games that get played off screen that the public wouldn't necessarily be privy to. I'm on the receiving end right now of hate campaigns, smear campaigns based around lies. You've experienced the same thing many times. Now, what I want to get to, though, is you've just recently found yourself on the receiving end of a Facebook ban. Now, from my perspective, I literally said just last week that I felt like things were easing up. I feel like sort of the low-hanging clouds have kind of eased up on the censorship front a little bit. And what's happened with you is kind of the one data point that really flies in the face of that. So tell us what's happened and tell us what you know about why, if you know anything about why that may have happened now with you.
Well, I'm allowing Cafe Lockdown. So we do a show every night. And then what we're doing around our 8 o'clock slot is we're allowing other streamers from around Australia to stream shows to it as well. So it's like a channel. We have about 6 doing it and some more coming on. And so it's like a freedom speech channel. And I interviewed one, I don't want to say what it is because I don't want you taken down. I interviewed one a lesbian woman. And the lesbian is important, who went to a Pride festival to stream it, and she got kicked out. And that's it. I just wanted to interview her to find out why she got kicked out.
Again, telling stories.
And that got us kicked off Facebook. And they said they have a 3-day streaming ban, but to date it's 6 days so far, and we can't contact anyone. There's no way to contact them. There's nothing.
No.
Yeah.
And this is very, very normal now. The rules are deliberately made extremely vague. They have the power to do pretty much whatever they want to do, and people like you and I really have no ability to push back in any meaningful sense, except for switching to alternate platforms, which is exactly what you've done. So in the spirit of collaboration, that's what the Aussie Wire is all about, and I know that that's what you're all about as well. Could you plug, where can people find you now that they can't find you on Facebook, or you can't stream on Facebook? Where can people find you?
Well, we've got Cafe Lockdown on Rumble. That's where all the interviews get basically catalogued. They're all staying there. So Cafe Lockdown Rumble, Cafe Lockdown Instagram, and Cafe Lockdown Twitter, where we don't post all the interviews, the smaller ones too. We do have the Cafe Lockdown Facebook pages where we can post the interviews up, but we can't stream. So it's a streaming ban, not a complete ban.
I see.
And the Odyssey as well, Cafe Lockdown Odyssey. But we've also set up our own Facebook called Closed Social, CLO.social. And if we can stream to that, we're hoping that'll become a freedom channel that's ours, and our contributors can stream there without fear or favor.
Yeah, beautiful. Last thing before we finish up, just in case there are people that have no idea what Cafe Lockdown is about and the stories that you're telling. And again, these are real people's stories that they can't get out any other way. You're, in a very real sense, you're providing a community service. What is one of the standout stories? What are the cliff notes of one of the standout stories that you've heard over the last year plus that you've been doing this? Just to give us a taste of why people should go and find you and actually start. I mean, now you've done over 1,000 interviews. That's a long back catalogue of stuff for people to binge watch. What's one of the standout stories in your mind that you've captured?
One of the most remarkable stories was a girl called Tash. Now, I've got a small collection of the Forest of the Fallen, who I found Selkie doing that in Launceston, and so I called it the Forest of the Fallen for that interview. And then I started taking it town to town in little bits, and just helping it spread. We were just trying to help it spread. Now it's everywhere. Now what we did was, when I was putting it up one day, one girl called Tash, for some reason I looked at her page, and so I wondered where she was in Australia. I reached out to her, and I found she was in Lismore. And she was in the second nursing home to get vaccinated. They came in to vaccinate all the residents and the staff, and they didn't tell them, she claims, that it was the COVID jab. They said it was the flu shot. They all felt pretty sick, but they kept going. When they came back a second time to give the COVID shot, she and several others said, we don't want the COVID shot. And they said, well, you've already had one. And so then they signed a consent form. There was no consent form for the first one. They were just given it. The manager who forced them all to get it, really pushed them to get it, quit before she had to take hers. So she did a runner. And now Tash is basically, well, she could be dying. Her heart is in such a bad way. She's never had a bad heart before. She really struggles. Her skin is covered in these white blotches. She has no energy. She's got a 10-year-old daughter who's beautiful, who she wonders what's going to happen to her. And there's carnage out here, Topher. I get emotional talking about it, but I actually feel like a war correspondent. There's carnage out here, and it all happens under the indifference of our brothers and sisters. But there's carnage.
Look, Michael,
even the Forest of the Fallen, just to say something incredible about that. This isn't the unvaccinated in the forest. These are the vaccinated who have submitted their stories themselves to jab injury sites, and they're transcribed onto the bamboo posts, and they're planted by the outcast. It's quite extraordinary. It's a shrine for the people, by the people.
It's an extraordinary moment in history, and there are so many people who wanted to say to us, I'll just move on, leave it behind. And people like you and I would say in response, well, we would love to, but we're not going to leave the damaged people behind. We're not going to just turn our back on them and pretend like they don't matter and they don't exist. Michael, I massively respect the sacrifice that you've made and the effort that you've put into giving a voice to people who otherwise wouldn't have one. Thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire. I wish you all the very best getting back onto Facebook. But in the meantime, people can find you on Rumble and all those other channels that you mentioned. We'll put those links into the description of this video. Michael Gray-Griffith from Cafe Locked Out, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Topher. I appreciate it.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. As always, there's links in the video description where you can find our guests, videos we've referenced, and much more. If you like what we're doing here, please support us financially by becoming an Aussie Wire Insider, link in the video description. We release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m, and you can find all the past episodes of the Aussie Wire at theaussiewire.com. Thanks for watching. My name is Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.